Monster Hunter Wilds is finally here, and I'm not going to beat around the bush. Is it good? The simple answer is yes, it's absolutely incredible, but I know that you already know that. The game peaked at almost 1.4 million concurrent players on Steam. The game sold over 8 million copies in 3 days. Look, I go apeshit for Monster Hunter, I really do, but naturally that left me with a lot of questions surrounding what exactly this game was going to be. As we know, Monster Hunter games are never bad, a product of over 2 decades of iterative development, pairing top-notch enemy design with the best feeling third-person melee combat system in any game. Capcom have been tending to their golden goose since the series' inception all the way back in 2004, and trust me, you really can tell. Monster Hunter World is one of my favorite video games ever, and there are some very particular reasons why I loved it so much. Almost every single part of that game, the environments, the monsters, but most importantly the relationship between those things made World feel, to me at least, like one of the most jaw-droppingly immersive games I had ever played. The spaces you'd traverse were almost as much of an enemy as the monsters themselves. The intricate, detailed nature of its maps meant that you weren't just moving through them, you really had to contend with them. Learning their ins and outs was crucial, as the monsters that inhabited them were able to use those environments to their advantage just as you were. And the monsters themselves, from territorial dinosaurs to literal dragons, every hunt was a battle hard fought and hard won. TLDR, World, while not without problems, was really excellent. A stunning reinvention of series conventions while staying true to what mattered most. Smacking the shit out of a big monster and making a cool pair of pants with its skin. And then Monster Hunter Rise released in 2021, which sanded away a lot of the intermediary systems of World in favor of a faster-paced, more combat-focused experience. In some ways truer to classic Monster Hunter, but also significantly more streamlined than those older games, in part due to its initial release on the Switch. Rise was great. It really was, but a part of me longed for the more intentional, more methodical nature of World. So that's the main question I had when approaching Monster Hunter Wilds. How exactly would Capcom take that tried and tested Monster Hunter formula and iterate and improve on it? Would it be the true successor to World, or would it make a further effort to smooth over its rough edges like Rise did? And to be honest, I feel like the answer to that question lies somewhere in between. Monster Hunter Wilds marks a key moment in the history of the franchise. For a huge amount of people, especially in the West, World was their very first Monster Hunter game, and with that comes a lot of expectations about what this game should be. At a fundamental level, it is the Monster Hunter you know and love. Its combat feels the best that it's ever felt, and it boasts a significantly improved onboarding system for new players. It's absolutely breathtaking to behold. From its environments to the monsters themselves, Capcom's attention to detail is truly remarkable. The armor pieces, the weapon design, it all presents as a meaningful improvement to World's somewhat copy-pasted offerings. And perhaps most interestingly, the story and the writing, typically a weak point in Monster Hunter games, is actually really solid this time around. It has an interesting and eclectic cast of characters and takes some turns that I definitely didn't expect from a Monster Hunter title. Before I start complaining, I promise you, this review will come as a wholehearted recommendation from me, but in truth, the pursuit of a vastly streamlined experience unfortunately comes at the cost of at least a little of the magic that World brought to the table back in 2018. And it's going to take me this whole video to really be able to explain what I mean by that. So, without further ado, this is my review of Monster Hunter Wilds. It's a bit tough to know where to start with this one, so I'm going to talk about the narrative first. Monster Hunter games have never been known for their stories. They certainly have had plots, but they always presented as little more than a method of shepherding you through the game, giving you an excuse to get out into the world and fuck shit up. Monsters are acting weird, it's endangering the ecosystem, yada yada yada, you get it. This is not the case with Wilds, which came as a massive surprise to me. There is not just a greater focus on the game's narrative this time around, but the writing. It actually positions itself to make some interesting twists and turns as the game progresses. It's definitely a massive step up from previous outings, and while it's not the best story ever written by any means, it's not even close, there were some genuinely gut-wrenching moments that left me questioning what I thought I was doing, and the only reason I feel the need to point this out is the severe lack of a compelling plot in practically any other Monster Hunter game before it, except maybe Monster Hunter Stories, which doesn't really count. The game has some actual character development, and while not groundbreaking by any means, I did really come to like most of the cast, from members of the guild to the Wudwuds of the forest, Alma being a genuine standout. The main monster that you're hunting over the course of the game not only has an arc in and of itself, but as you progress through the story, the game is totally willing to place some genuine moral ambiguity on your actions, questioning what is truly righteous about your eco-warrior approach to making hats out of lizards. I don't want to or can't really say much more because I don't want to spoil it, but just know the writing is one of those things about this game that is just better than previous outings, and its characters, monsters included, really are the best part. And that is a principal point that will permeate practically every part of this procession, holy alliteration. And that's an important point that will permeate this review. The story is probably the only thing I feel that I can praise without caveat. I'm not lying when I say that I think that practically every aspect of Monster Hunter Wilds is really remarkable. The combat, the world design, presentation, by all means, Monster Hunter Wilds as its own experience, standalone, is fundamentally really solid, easily evidenced by those sales, those player numbers. The game rules. However, the game doesn't exist in a vacuum. As I said earlier, Monster Hunter is, and has always been, a product of years of iterative improvements. That's why the combat system is so good. It's not like a series where they fundamentally change things up with every release. Capcom has focused on making marginal, meaningful improvements to weapon feedback and the game's movesets that lead you to having 14 weapons that are each compelling enough to be the star offering of a whole-ass video game. It's this iterative approach to design that has almost defined Monster Hunter as a franchise. When World came out in 2018, its willingness to strip back a lot of the more obtuse elements of the Monster Hunter experience, placing a much stronger emphasis on making you feel like a hunter in the truest sense of the word. Tracking your prey through these dense environments actually didn't land super well with a lot of series veterans, and they felt there was perhaps too much downtime in between these encounters, the actual draw of the game. And look, I get it, but I think that World really had this immersion factor that was really hard to beat. Rise took a different direction, putting you in situations where you could reasonably just fight all the time, with vastly increased mobility with the addition of the Palamute. You didn't have to contend with the environment in the same way, as the addition of the mount and the wire bug meant that you could basically just jump over everything. You didn't have to learn the spaces, you didn't have to learn much of anything, and Capcom knew this and instinctively designed those spaces with a larger focus on these less detailed combat arenas that did the exact job that they needed to do, acting as a space for fights to take place. TLDR, World felt like you were really pushing through an unfamiliar and hostile environment, whereas Rise removed a lot of that struggle when it came to traversal. But at what cost? Monster Hunter Wilds presents you with these gorgeously detailed spaces, complex winding interiors, canopies on treetops, dense, lush jungles. The best part about these spaces is that they feel alive, well and truly, like you could reach out and touch them. Depending on the time of day or the weather, more on that in a sec, you'll encounter a change in endemic life, outbreaks of certain insects. Capcom have really gone to great lengths at making this world feel like it lives and breathes, just like you and just like the monsters. It's a modeled ecosystem where monsters will prey on smaller foes, and it feels like it exists without your input. All of this is exemplified through the game's seasons. It's used very early on as the main plot device. The land you're exploring has these ebbs and flows stemming from something you don't quite understand at the time. The world, the unexplored forbidden lands the game refers to it as, cycles through a period of decay, followed by some inclement weather, a storm of some kind based on the locale, before the environment flourishes when the rain finally lets up. The season of plenty. The seasonal variation is not just a background process that can be ignored, it's a fundamental part of the game that affects many things, from the resources you'll find, to the monsters that'll appear, and to the way that you'll fight in these spaces. For example, the Thunder Wyvern Ray Dow, during the inclemency in the desert, can be struck by lightning, temporarily empowering its attacks against you. The point being, the game is well and truly committed to using these environments and their variation in interesting ways that can have real impacts on the way that you play. Emphasis on the word can. You see, depending on how you choose to engage with the map, it can either be incredibly immersive and richly detailed, or, like Rise Before It, you can breeze past it on your mount that will move on autopilot to the monster that you're targeting, which the game heavily encourages you to do, by the way, and in some cases actively requires it. While I found exploring the maps to be far more interesting on foot, as it really allowed me to take in the spaces and understand how they were designed, there are some paths that are completely inaccessible without your mount, meaning that it's actually pretty inconvenient to move around the world without it, encouraging you to just mount up by default and autopilot to wherever the monster is. There is no tracking like in World, despite a couple of instances in the main story pretending like you're searching for monsters. The majority of the time, the monsters are just revealed on the map from mission start, and off you go. Don't get me wrong, I understand why Capcom chose to do this. Some players expressed frustration at the tedium of locating a monster at the start of missions in World, as you first had to find some tracks or something similar before it was eventually revealed to you. To those players, this rudimentary system was something that took them out of the game. To them, it felt kind of like meaningless bloat that got in between them and the part of the game they really wanted to experience. They felt that they spent as much time locating the monster and figuring out how to get to it as they did actually fighting it. For me, however, that system added so much to the immersion of World, it really made me feel like I was searching, like I was hunting for my target. I think that system did a lot to encourage you as a player to really learn the lay of the land, to not just see the map, but to understand it, and be capable of using it to your advantage just as the monsters you were fighting could. In Wilds, the inclusion of the mount, the sacred, does remove some of that tedium for sure. It places more of an emphasis on actually fighting the monsters, as you don't ever really have to consider how you're going to get to them. But to me, part of the magic of World was this feeling of pushing through these environments, contending with a space that was just as hostile and unforgiving as the enemies you are up against. And now you've been given the ability to just skip past all of it. These beautiful maps that Capcom have created, their intricacies, they sort of fail to serve the same purpose, as you're never asked to contend with the space when you can just breeze past all of it on your sacred. The game's third area especially, I never really felt like I learned its layout in any meaningful way, as the sacred would always just autopilot me to my target. The part that frustrates me the most about this is that I partially understand why it's like this. I'm not blind to it, but to be completely honest, I just wish that Wilds was more willing to take its time, to slow down a little, as part of what makes Monster Hunter special, to me at least, is that more intentional, methodical experience that World reveled in. There are moments when the game does try to do this, particularly in the first season of Plenty in the main story. It really asks you to take in and sit with what's just happened, and to see the beauty in its spaces, but sadly, these moments are few and far between, and to me at least, that was a bit of a letdown. These spaces are so beautifully designed and intricately detailed, but it really feels like the game doesn't care to show them to you in any meaningful way, as it's obsessed with moving forward at all times. And some people are really gonna like that, but the pace just wasn't for me. On a bit of a lighter note, something that World did really well was selling the idea that these monsters were well and truly inhabiting these environments, and that you were by all means an invader of sorts. You'd fight beasts on their home turf, in their nests, their habitats, and this really came together in a few climactic battles. My best touch point was Diabolos, who would retreat to its lair, tunneling underground before ambushing you through a wall of sand. Rise's maps really lacked this sense of place. They functioned well enough as battle arenas, but they didn't have the identity of individual monsters written all over them. In Rise, it felt like you could have fought anything anywhere, but in World, the climax of a lot of these fights felt meaningful because you were challenging these beasts in their own homes and on their own terms. Wilds takes a good middle ground between these two philosophies, I feel. Its maps are much wider than Worlds by comparison, and as such present a little more like traditional combat arenas, but some specific encounters, like the apex predators of each region, will culminate in these spectacle-fueled set-piece encounters where the monsters really utilize the environment in one last-ditch effort for survival, even more so than they did in World. Uthduna, the Scarlet Forest's Leviathan fight, takes place during the inclemency, and I won't spoil the ending in case you haven't seen it, but oh my god, it is such a sight to behold. It's likely my favourite encounter of the whole game, or at least up there. The trade-off here is that a lot of the monsters just sort of exist in the world and don't really have a specific lair or habitat, especially in high rank when monsters just start showing up outside of their normal zones. There are definitely some standouts when it comes to monster nests, Lullabarina and Nursilla being particularly memorable, but yeah, some are definitely less interesting than others, and in the final zone, none of the monsters even seem to have dens at all, apart from one. I think that's a pretty good segue into the monster roster and their designs, and I want to talk about this in a little bit more of a broad sense to avoid spoiling too much if you haven't played the game yet or aren't that far in. This is another thing that I have almost no qualms about, especially in comparison to World. A common complaint with World, and even Iceborne to some degree, was that a lot of the monsters fit into a couple of very specific archetypes. With a couple of exceptions, looking at you, Radjang, practically every single monster in World was either a dinosaur or a dragon, and even those felt a little similar to each other. The over-representation of the Brute Wyvern class, effectively a T-Rex shaped monster, while not a huge issue as there was definitely some variation within that class, meant that its diverse monster offering felt a little smaller than older games. In regards to the variation in Wilds, Capcom have absolutely smashed it out of the park here. There are your typical mainstays, Rathalos and the like, but especially in terms of new and returning monsters, practically every single monster feels significantly different to actually fight, even the color swap variants of certain monsters due to their differing movesets. This variation not only extends to archetypes, but their size as well. There are a good chunk of monsters that are really quite small, and some that are absolutely gargantuan. A weird thing, however, this is the only mainline Monster Hunter game without any Elder Dragons, and I get that they were used a little bit heavily in World, but to see them completely absent here feels a little bit strange. Another system that was showcased in the beta is the ability for monsters to group together in packs, the main culprit here being Doshugama. This dog-bear hybrid will travel in groups of 3 to 4, smaller variations surrounding an alpha, a much larger, more aggressive specimen. I initially thought that the game was going to use this system to great lengths, as it's definitely a unique enough change to offer some genuinely interesting scenarios, but no. Doshugama is really the only monster that makes use of this system, and that might be fine if the system was actually fleshed out enough to offer some challenge, but the way that the game expects you to handle these packs is just to shoot bombs made of shit at them which will disperse the group and then fight the alpha one-on-one. The implication of this could be really interesting. I just wonder why Capcom even bothered including this at all if its implementation was going to be so lackluster. A real missed opportunity in my opinion. There are other monsters that hang out in groups, but there are no alpha variations to be seen, and the only thing the game expects you to do is disperse the groups and take them out solo. Shame. So with such a diverse monster roster, the gear you can make to fight the bigger and badder monsters is equally as impressive. Some of the weapons and armor sets look great. It feels like Capcom really listened to complaints when it came to World's weapon design. A key pillar of Monster Hunter games is this exciting moment where after you take down an enemy, you'd rush to the blacksmith to see what cool weapons you could craft with its parts. These weapons have been a staple of the franchise, each resembling some aspect of the monster's design. It really made you feel like you were wielding a part of the beast you had just felled, except in World, where a lot of the weapons simply looked like variations of the stock design with some minor flourishings to tell you that this is the Diabolos Greatsword or something similar. This was a little better in Iceborne, but ultimately failed to live up to series expectations from older games where almost every single weapon was completely unique and really fit the monster's designs. I'm really happy to say that Wild has basically completely remedied this. Practically every single weapon has a unique theme that really manages to speak true to the monster's design. This extends to your armor and also your Palico's equipment too. I had mine running around as a literal brain in a jar using parts from Rumpa Polo, one of Wild's new additions. I really mean it. If you felt let down by the weapon designs in World, Capcom has heard you and basically done everything they could to remedy that. Their designs are really, really great. This high level of presentation extends to practically every aspect of the game as well. You've already seen the stunning food animations, I'm sure. True story, as I was playing this game, there would be times that I'd forget to eat, and the food animations were so good that I'd get so hungry that I needed to stop playing and make myself a meal. Crazy. Seriously, the food looks so good that it's boosted the sales of cheese naan in Nepalese restaurants in Japan. I'm not going to show too much, but like, Monster Hunter has always showed off food in just the right way, and it's just as good here. I've seen some people suggest that the environments in the game somehow look bad, and seriously, these people are lying. That seasonal variation I mentioned before is a key pillar of the game's presentation. There are points, especially in the season of fallow, where the land looks really intentionally quite grey and dull. So, when the season of plenty finally arrives, the contrast between these two states means that you can really appreciate how lush and beautiful the environments look by comparison. It may not be the best looking game ever from a pure visual fidelity standpoint, but the art direction, the color work, it really is second to none. These environments look quite incredible, from the rolling dunes of the desert to the lush scarlet forest densely populated with flora and fauna. Every environment looks meaningfully different, and again, this is a perfect encapsulation of that idea that art direction matters infinitely more than visual fidelity alone, although the game is no slouch when it comes to that either. I was looking back through my notes as I was writing this, and practically everything was positive, but there was this recurring theme throughout. Monsters are great and unique, I just wish the difficulty was a little bit higher. Combat is great, new moves feel satisfying, but they can make the game feel a bit too easy at times. Monster Hunter is that kind of game you can sort of play forever. It's not exactly a live service, but in a way it functions similarly. Each weapon is so complicated to learn, and traditionally, encounters were really quite challenging as a way to facilitate that learning. And yeah, don't get me wrong, combat in Wilds does feel excellent. Weapon feedback is great, the sound design is fantastic, and a lot of the new moves feel super reactive when it comes to parries, offset attacks, and power clashes. The thing about these new systems is every single weapon feels as good to use as it ever has. There is a level of fluidity in Wild's combat that is unmatched, but due to this fluidity, your power level as a player has gone up quite significantly, and this is true of every single weapon. Part of this is due to the focus system added in this game. As you beat the shit out of the monster you're fighting, eventually it'll develop wounds, which can be attacked for increased damage. The focus system means that you can effectively aim your normal attacks, allowing you much more precision when targeting these wounds or specific monster parts or the like. This might initially seem fine, were it not for one specific mechanic that is available on every single weapon. Aiming your weapon and pressing a specific input will lock you into a slow animation called a focus strike. If you miss, you're put into a bad position with a slow attack, usually allowing the monster to get a free hit in, but if this attack hits a wound specifically, it will continue with a follow-up attack and cause the monster to flinch, cancelling any attack that it was currently performing. And if you know how Monster Hunter combat works, you know how much of a big deal that is. Look, I mainly play Insect Glaive in Monster Hunter, and let me tell you something. Some of these new mechanics feel really good, but when it comes to balancing, they are absolutely busted. For those that don't know, the Insect Glaive is a weapon that has two fundamental components: the glaive itself and a little flying kinsect buddy that you can send out to attack the monster at will. The kinsect's job is to collect extracts, which it does so by hitting specific parts of the monster. What each does is not super important, but when you collect all three, it powers up your attacks, changing the moveset of the glaive to attack significantly faster. The insect glaive then has always had this dual cadence to it. In phase 1 of the encounter, you would strategically maneuver around the monster with the goal of collecting these extracts before finally going in once you were fully powered up. There was this flow to it that felt very distinct, and that's why I love playing that weapon so much. Part of the balancing of the insect glaive is that these extracts expire, meaning you'll have to collect them again, lest having vastly reduced combat power. Not every weapon, but most weapons in the game have some level of resource management baked into them that requires you to be a little more engaged. Here's the thing though. There are two mechanics that were added to the insect glaive that absolutely trivialize this system to the point where it almost feels completely absent. Entering focus mode means that your kinsect will also attack along the path of your insect glaive, vastly increasing your damage output to the point where it almost feels necessary to just leave focus mode on 100% of the time, but crucially, as the kinsect attacks, it will collect extracts from the monster at the same time. Part of what makes extract collection difficult is due to the fact that you had to manually control the kinsect, aiming specifically for certain body parts. Aiming for those parts is much easier when you have an aiming reticle, effectively removing a huge skill-based component of this weapon and a massive component of the insect glaive's playstyle. It's not just this though. Performing a successful focus strike with the glaive not only causes the monster to flinch twice, but you'll leap backwards to reposition and immediately be granted all three extracts. Insect glaive players know how big of a deal this is. Any downtime that you might have had in these previous games, collecting extracts is effectively completely unnecessary once you figure this out, and it turned me into an absolute killing machine. Seriously, I was soloing some of the hardest fights in the game in under 10 minutes, and I never felt like I was at risk of dying outside of some select circumstances. And most weapons are like this. Resource management is severely streamlined to a point where you barely even need to think about it, if at all. Look, I get toning down some of these systems makes the game more accessible, and it's clearly worked. This game has sold absolute gangbusters, but I can't help but feel like there is a happy middle ground that Wilds failed to hit. With this hugely increased player power level, it really feels like the monsters have been absolutely gutted by comparison. Here's my biggest problem with this. Rise had the exact same issue. Your kit was so much more versatile in that game that a lot of the fights felt kind of trivial, but I, huffing some mad copium, thought, This is only because Rise was designed for a handheld. They're trying to make the game faster so you could play it on the bus or something, and they would revert to a significantly higher difficulty level when returning to Wilds, and I couldn't have been more wrong. Wilds somehow feels easier than Rise did, and I don't know, to me, Monster Hunter just isn't Monster Hunter if you're not at least a little terrified of what you're going up against, a feeling that permeated almost the entirety of World and the games that came before it. This unfortunately gets worse in multiplayer, where a lot of the time, even an uncoordinated squad can effectively just stunlock any monster by utilizing focus mode and the wounds, meaning that fights can often be over in like 5 minutes sometimes, a far cry from some of the more challenging encounters in World, which could have been 30 to 40 minutes of white-knuckled struggle. I have to reiterate this, right? The combat system is still the best that it's ever been, maybe the best third-person melee combat in any video game on the market, and it is still tons of fun. But the shift in player power and agency needed to be matched by something on the monster side. I'm serious when I say this. If the hardest monsters did double or triple the damage they do currently, I still think the game might be too easy. They just barely pose any threat to you at all, and that means that this incredibly impressive combat system just feels wasted, especially in the endgame. And just briefly, the endgame grind has also been significantly streamlined. There are vastly more ways to get specific items that you need, and decorations are overall much easier to acquire. Here's the thing though. I played about 45 hours of Monster Hunter Wilds, and I really did enjoy every single second of it. But there's very little that makes me want to come back and play anymore, and I think that's a good point to wrap up on. Look, there is no such thing as a bad Monster Hunter game. I have to say this again, the game is incredible, and if you pick it up, you're gonna have an absolute blast. But I can't help but feel that Monster Hunter Wilds, in its attempt to streamline its systems in hopes of appealing to a wider audience, feels like it's suffocating under the weight of the greats that came before it. Practically every aspect of this game, when taken on its own, is absolutely fantastic. The story, whilst not groundbreaking, is a massive step up from previous outings, offering a really strong emotional foundation, some great characters and character moments, and beautifully rendered cutscenes that, at times, can be absolutely hype-inducing. The world, at times, has this incredible sense of tactility to it. It feels like it lives and breathes, like you could reach out and touch it. It's a fully functional ecosystem that presents absolutely gorgeously. However, the game's desire to constantly funnel you to the next thing means that you seldom get the chance to truly soak in it. In truth, I just wish that the game was willing to slow down at times and let its best elements shine. Its core loop, fighting massive monsters to make weapons from their parts to fight increasingly stronger monsters, is honestly just as Moorish as it's always been, and this is due to great looking weapons and armor that will make you want to go out and fight to get them, and this paired with a combat system that feels the best that it's ever felt. I really mean this. It's an absolute blast to play, doubly so due to its spectacle and truly exciting encounters, but its balancing, especially late game, honestly feels so off base that I don't really understand why the product was shipped like this. I get that they're gonna add harder fights later, and perhaps this will all flip on its head when the expansion comes out, but right now at least, the game is so easy that I don't really have any desire to keep playing it, and trust me, I'm a Monster Hunter stan. I know it doesn't sound like I think this, but every single part of this game taken on its own is fantastic. I do genuinely think that the game is great. But Monster Hunter Wilds doesn't exist in a vacuum, and despite its impressive attempts at streamlining some of its more obtuse systems, I can't help but feel like a little bit of the magic, a little bit of what makes Monster Hunter has been lost here, and to me, that's at least a little disappointing. Whoa, So that's not how I expected this to go at all. I have hundreds and hundreds of hours across a fair few Monster Hunter games, and by far, this is my favorite series, and this was definitely my most anticipated game of the year. Don't get me wrong, the game is great, but when taken against the absolute magic of World, I don't know, it just didn't fully click with me, and that's totally okay. For those of you that watch these outros, this is reset button lore. I'm titling this The Monster Hunter Wilds Incident. So what's next? Pirate Yakuza is still happening. I'm still tossing up on whether or not it's a good idea to talk about Assassin's Creed Shadows, and I really want to play Wonder Stop as well. Anyway, you know the drill. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Like the video if you liked it, all that jazz. What have you guys been playing? Definitely keen to know. Hope you'll have the best day. Catch you in the next one.